I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, the Biden administration is backing Democrats' sweeping ethics and election reform bill to overhaul the nation's rules for voting and funding political campaigns. But Republicans argue the package will fuel voter fraud and take powers away from states. Arizona Attorney General Mark Brnovich, who defended his state's election integrity laws before the Supreme Court this week, and Democratic strategist Mary Anne Marsh weigh in on the debate over the bill and share their different plans to restore faith in elections. And March is Women's History Month. Fox News at Night host Shannon Bream explores some of the remarkable female figures written about in Scripture. Her upcoming book, titled The Women of the Bible Speak, the wisdom of 16 women and their lessons for today, and opens up about her own faith. Plus commentary from former Arkansas governor and Fox News contributor Mike Huckabee. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcast.com.
I'm Harris Faulkner.
I'm Greg Gutfeld.
I'm Janice Dean, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, March 3rd, 2021. I'm Jessica Rosenthal. Who can change how we vote is up for debate before the Supreme Court.
I'm very skeptical. Anyone comes along and says we're going to create a federal or one-size-fits-all solution.
And lawmakers are arguing over it as well.
The best thing to do is to have Congress reinstate the Voting Rights Act and pass H.R. 1.
I'm Dave Anthony. We're going to take you inside the Bible. Shannon Bream on her new book telling stories about women back then that are relatable now.
These women face problems, even though their lives were thousands of years ago, things that are very much real-world 2021 problems. And you see how they work through them and how they rely on faith.
And I'm Mike Huckabee. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
Last year may have been the year for voting, but this year may be the year for voting laws. Congress is debating a massive bill that would impact voting on a national scale. It's called H.R. 1, or the For the People Act, which Senate Minority Leader Republican Mitch McConnell recently slammed.
Their bill would take prudential questions about early voting, registration, and no-excuse absentee balloting and resolve them one way for the entire nation. They want to force all 50 states to allow the absurd practice of ballot harvesting.
There are also multiple proposed laws in states around the country that would change voting rules. Senate Majority Leader Democrat Chuck Schumer criticized the Republican proposals this week from the Senate floor.
When you lose an election in a democratic society, you update your party platform and appeal to more voters. You don't change the rules to make it harder for your opponents to vote.
And this week, the Supreme Court heard arguments about the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, as it pertains to two laws in the state of Arizona. One that restricts who can gather up your vote and turn it in for you, known as ballot harvesting, and another that required ballots cast at the wrong precinct to be discarded. Now, Section 2 prohibits laws that can discriminate based on race, and the Democratic National Committee sued Arizona, alleging these laws violated Section 2. While a federal judge said the laws did not violate Section 2, a full panel of the Ninth Circuit said they did, writing that minority voters were more likely to cast ballots at the wrong precinct, and restricting who can collect ballots disproportionately impacts minority voters, who the court found are more likely to need help turning their ballots in.
It is incorrect, and the DNC is absolutely wrong to any way imply that these laws are racially motivated. And as I said, a majority of states have similar types of statutes. And if you accept the logic of the Ninth Circuit, it essentially would gut or jeopardize every single voting integrity law in this country every time there's a statistical anomaly. And that just can't be correct.
Mark Brnovich is the Attorney General in Arizona, and he argued for the state before the Supreme Court Tuesday.
Arizona, we provide all sorts of methods to people to exercise the franchise. There's no excuse absentee balloting. You can vote early. We have voting centers. We have drop-off boxes in some counties. You can vote up to 27 days before the election. So there are all sorts of ways that people could exercise their franchise. And as Justice Alito pointed out, is when about 80% of people in Arizona vote by mail. So one of the stats the Ninth Circuit hung its hat on was the percentage of African Americans versus white voters that had voted out of precinct. Well, the reality is we're talking about a number of about 4,000 votes out of millions cast. So we are argued and we said that that was not substantial, and you can't have courts overturning a state's election laws every time there's some statistical anomaly, because there may be numerous reasons for that, and unless it's significant, courts are going to be micromanaging and getting themselves involved in every single state's election, and basically we're going to have to litigate every single state election law literally every time there's an election.
There is a proposed new law that Congress is debating. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's called the For the People Act. It would result in broad changes to voting rules, mandating early voting, same-day registration. It also claims that it would restore the Voting Rights Act, though much of that effort, I think, is actually happening through separate legislation. But anyway, the restoration is meant to sort of remedy the fact that the Supreme Court invalidated Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. And that section required certain states or jurisdictions with a history of discrimination to get federal approval before they alter any voting procedure. I'm wondering how you think a ruling impacting Section 2, which is what you're involved in, how that will impact the debate around voting rules and regulations going forward with this new For the People Act. And do you think either way, a court ruling on this will light a fire under this debate?
First and foremost, I do think it's important for the U.S. Supreme Court to provide certainty in this area. And that's one of the reasons why we were articulating and proposing our test, that you have to show a substantial disparate impact, and then two, you have to show causation, and you have to look at, once again, the totality of circumstances in that voting system. And so, that's, the first thing the court needs to do. Now, second, as far as what Congress may do, I learned a long time ago not to rely on what's happening in Washington, D.C. Sometimes out here, I joke that Washington, D.C. is where good ideas go to die, because the reality is that Congress can't seem to get anything done. So I think it's problematic for anyone that's relying on Washington, D.C. to solve a problem. And part of the reason, big part of that reason is that that's not what Washington, D.C., or that's not what Congress is designed to do. The powers were supposed to be few and defined. And I always remind folks that the federal government did not create the states. The states created the federal government.
After the election we had, though, and the claims that were made in the 2020 election, is some uniformity, a good idea? Should there be some rules or regulations that sort of permeate throughout all of the states, not even just in response to what happened in 2020, but just for the sake moving forward of some uniformity?
The question really comes down to, should someone in California be telling Arizona how to run their elections? And, what the Constitution requires is we want to make sure that no one is disenfranchised, that we're protecting everyone's right to vote. But different states may have different methods for the best way to, secure the integrity of that vote and to ensure an orderly and fair election. And, what may work in some rural state may not be different than what works in, New York City. And so I'm very skeptical. Anyone comes along and says we're going to create a federal or one-size-fits-all solution. What I instead would argue or say to you is that the problem is the Supreme Court hasn't articulated any tests when it comes to Section 2, and what we need is for the Supreme Court to basically say, this is what states can do and this is what they can do, and that way you don't have judges basically rewriting election laws so close to an election. And I think that's part of the problem, is when you have unelected judges, whether they're state or federal judges, and look at the states that have the most problems. Those were states where there was changes being substantively made to the process of how votes were counted, extending, deadlines on curing ballots, accepting mail-in ballots. So those were issues that, the federal law is not going to solve. The problem is that you have judges that are creating chaos, weeks into an election or even after early balloting starting. That's the problem.
Are you hopeful, given the majority here on the Supreme Court, that the justices will side with you? Some folks, on a more left-leaning side say that, they're worried that when it comes to Section 2 and this debate that you've argued before the court, that they're going to lose.
We have a very strong case, and I am very confident in our case. I think I did a good job arguing the case. And at the end of the day, we didn't get to say this, but I was waiting for the opportunity to remind the justices that even the Biden Department of Justice, filed a letter saying that our laws do not violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So I am confident that we are on the right side and that legally what Arizona has done is consistent with the U.S. Constitution and also consistent with the Voting Rights Act.
Finally, Republican state lawmakers have quite a few proposed bills in dozens of states right now pertaining to how we vote. The left-leaning Brennan Center for Justice says they are bills proposed by Republicans to restrict voting access. What do you say to that, accusations that Republicans are trying to restrict voting with these laws?
I don't know what the legislature is going to do or not do, not only in Arizona, but especially in other states. As I said, there's an old saying, Mark Twain said that no person's life, liberty, or property is safe when the legislature's in session. And so it's disappointing that someone like the Brennan Center would try to make this a partisan issue, because I don't think it's a partisan issue. I think this is all about securing the vote and making sure we have integrity in the process and people have confidence in the result, period.
Now, some strongly disagree with that, like Democratic strategist Marianne Marsh.
Ever since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act almost 8 years ago, we have seen increasing steps to restrict people's access to voting. There isn't a voting integrity problem. There isn't a security problem. That wasn't true in 2020, and it hasn't been true for years. But what there has been and continues to be, especially in the wake of 2020, is legislation passed by individual states that make it harder for people to vote, and especially people of color. That is indisputable. Arizona is guilty of that in this case that they're trying to defend. When they talk about going to all mail voting, many Native Americans who live in Arizona don't live on a postal route. Therefore, you're discriminating against them. In Georgia, they passed the most restrictive legislation ever, shortening the general election to 4 weeks, shortening the number of days you can vote, shortening no voting on Sundays when everybody knows that Black voters, many of them go to the polls on Sunday after church, a day many don't work, and they're organized to go vote. They even put in a provision that you can't distribute bottles of water when you're standing in line to vote. When you reduce the number of voting locations in certain districts, which have been in Georgia, North Carolina, and other places, communities of color, the lines are longer, and many people aren't able to stand in them because they have to go to work, or they're on shift work and they can't miss a shift because they'll lose their job and lose their pay. So there are many, many insidious ways to make it harder, if not impossible, for people to vote. And that's un-American and undermines our democracy.
Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, though, was what was argued this week before the Supreme Court. And many Democrats are worried, due to the court's majority, about preserving Section 2, which says you cannot have voting laws that discriminate based on race. And I guess the worry is that while this may help address issues that arise after the fact, it is all that is left after the Supreme Court invalidated Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. And that section forced, new voting laws to get federal approval in jurisdictions that had a history of discrimination. Are you among those who are worried about Section 2 and where the court falls here?
Yes, absolutely. And I think any objective person who supports democracy and voting rights is concerned. And that's why there's a push to pass H.R. 1 in Congress, because it includes the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that would make a federal mandate in terms of access to voting across the board. And while it wouldn't take away individual states' abilities to enforce certain regulations and others, it certainly would stop discrimination. Now, when you listen to some of the questioning and the arguments, you want to feel a little optimistic, but it's very hard to feel optimistic when you look at the current composition of the court, and certainly John Roberts' role earlier when he served in the Reagan administration and his opposition to voting rights. So there's plenty of concern for everyone. The best thing to do is to have Congress reinstate the Voting Rights Act and pass H.R. 1, which would provide a federal mandate for people to be able to vote and have access to voting.
Marianne Marsh, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
This is Mike Huckabee with your Fox News commentary coming up.
We're about to take you back in time, way back, to a time that has been read about and studied for centuries in the Bible. Now today, we're going to focus on some people who are sometimes overlooked. Shannon Bream has a new book out titled The Women of the Bible Speak, the wisdom of 16 women and their lessons for today.
My faith is the center of my life, and so to dig into these stories that I've heard growing up in church and Sunday school and feeling like, well, I've got a pretty good grasp of this, to really dig into these women's lives, I learned so much.
Shannon Bream, of course, is also the host of Fox News at Night on TV and has her own podcast with a great name, Livin The Bream.
So it's really one of those books, whether you're a person of faith or not, I think there will be all kinds of new things to discover, as I certainly did. And I was really inspired because these women face problems, even though their lives were thousands of years ago, things that are very much real world 2021 problems. And you see how they work through them and how they rely on faith. And some of them get off track and come up with other plans that are not in line with what God had planned. But even in that, what I love is that he was able to use their missteps, just like he can for us now. We all get off track and off path sometimes, but there's still good that can come from that. And I saw that in these women's stories.
And what motivated you? What made you say, women are often not the focus of a lot of Bible stories or books in the Bible? What was it that said, I really want to bring these stories to light?
Yeah, because I think there's stuff that's so good for now. I mean, it isn't just old, dusty, boring fairy tales. I mean, these are real stories about women's lives who they may be overlooked sometimes, but I really, growing up in church and going to religious school all the way through my undergrad and college, I was exposed to a lot of these stories. And I thought, you know what? A lot of people probably have never heard of some of these women. Of course, people are familiar with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and maybe Queen Esther. But there's so many stories here of women who really rose to the occasion. They found courage. They found faith. And I thought, man, I love that these stories are there, but if people don't know them and can't sort of be challenged and encouraged by them, we need to get them out there. So, I'm really thankful that this is one of the first books coming under Fox News' book label. And I'm so glad that they decided to tell these stories and let me help do that.
It's interesting. You mentioned Mary, the mother of Jesus, and also Mary Magdalene. You tell their story at the end of the book, as opposed to making them first, because they may be the names that people know the most. Why'd you put them last?
We sort of work through the Old Testament through to the New Testament. So it's a bit of it is chronological, but some of these women, we study them in pairs and look at the commonalities in their lives, the common threads or lessons that we can learn. But it was really sort of chronological through the Bible. But actually, there's a little intro that starts the book, who is a woman from the New Testament. We don't even know her name, but her story was clearly so important that it was included in a number of the Gospels. It's told multiple times about this woman who had this physical problem for 12 years. She had an issue of bleeding, and we knew she went from doctor to doctor. We're told when we meet her, she basically has lost everything. She's had no physical help, no doctor who's been able to solve her problem, and she's spent everything she has looking for help.
And she's been shunned pretty much by society, correct?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And that's such a great point you bring up, because that in that time period, she would have been considered unclean. So probably from what we know about her, she wouldn't have been able to go to the markets or into crowds to the temple to worship or her faith community. She would have been pretty much homebound.
An outcast, really.
Idea. Yeah, and there are so many women in this book who are outcasts, but Christ reaches out to them regardless. He doesn't care about the rules of the day or what anybody says is the right thing to do. And in this case, this woman hears about Jesus. She hears about these miracles and thinks, all right, if I can just touch the hem of this guy's garment, there's something there and I think I can be healed. So here she is going out in a crowd where she shouldn't be. She does finally get to him, touches that garment, and the Bible says immediately she was healed. But also that Christ knew, clearly he knew what was going on. And he says to one of his disciples, who touched me? Now, anytime he asks a question or God asks a question in the Bible, he knows the answer already. So he's now waiting for her. And the disciple sort of laughs like, hey, you're in this crowd. Everybody's touching you. She is in fear and trembling, we're told, falls before him. Now, she knows he could expose her, that she shouldn't even be there. She is this outcast. He could have shamed her in front of all these people. What are you doing touching me? You didn't even ask for my help. And he calls her daughter, which I think is the most beautiful thing, showing everyone, now that he has a crowd with him everywhere he goes, giving her complete acceptance. And he says, your faith has healed you. It's made you whole. and he doesn't chastise or embarrass her. And think about the desperation she's had over these 12 years, and now it's all over in an instant because of her faith. And I just think that has so many parallels and stories and lessons for us today, and just how merciful he was and how he really didn't, and we talk about this a lot in the New Testament section of the book, he didn't follow the rules of the day. If he saw women in need or people who were outcast, he reached out to them. And I think he does that for all of us today.
You pair people and the women in your stories differently. In one of the sections, you have a free woman compared to her slave. You have a queen paired with a prostitute. I mean, you're very diverse people that you're trying to put together.
Yeah, and I think people need to know that just like the men in the Bible, the women in the Bible are not sanitized. I mean, we see them with all of their thorns and their stories and all of their foibles. And yes, I mean, I thought when we put together Queen Esther and Rahab, who was known as a prostitute, they both were critical in moments to save the entire nation of Israel, the people of the Jewish nation. And I thought, I love that that's that parallel with them. Their lives couldn't have been more different, but both of them were called to step up in this moment, to have extreme courage and to risk their own lives to save the entire nation, the entire Jewish people. So they had that common thread. And I thought, how beautiful that we can see, it doesn't matter what your background is, where you come from, if you're royalty or if you're somebody who would be considered on the outcast and fringe and lower part of society by many people, you can still be used by God. And I love that about their two stories.
You know, you also have paired people who lived centuries apart. They would never have known each other. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So is it just that they had similar experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, many of these women wouldn't have known each other in any way, but we see that they have different experiences of faith. I think about Hannah and I think about Miriam, and both of them are from the Old Testament. Hannah, we see her story in that she was childless and her husband had another wife, which was, the custom in that day, who not only had several children, but she mocked and made fun of and cruelly taunted Hannah because she couldn't have children, which is the desire of her heart. And we see that she went to the temple every year and prayed, to the point one time where the priest Eli pulled her out and thought she was drunk and said, "You need to leave the temple." And she said, no, I'm just weeping before God. I'm begging and asking him for something. What Eli would later find out when she returned with her child Samuel, that it was the son she was praying for. And she had told God, "I will give you this child to come back and serve you." And that's what she did with Samuel. She left him with Eli the priest, and he went on to serve and to be the one who found King David and to recognize him as the leader of the nation of Israel. So, she really gave up this child that meant everything to her. Miriam, the sister of Moses, is the one who stood by when, the king and the Pharaoh had said all of the children there, the Hebrew children, had to be thrown into the Nile River and killed. And his parents, his mother, was brave enough that she made a little mini ark almost for him, a little thatched basket, and sent Miriam to put him into the river and watch to see what happened to him. So again, Miriam is there as Moses is discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, who then wants to raise him as her own. So in both cases, we see these precious sons, these children, are sent off to an unknown fate, but wind up in great service to God.
You wrote in your introduction, for many of us, 2020 was a year filled with pain, physical, financial, emotional, mental. And so for those readers who had those experiences, when they read all of what these women went through, do you find it relatable?
Yeah, I'm hoping that they'll see these women shared common burdens. They were betrayed, some of them. They dealt with jealousy. They dealt with heartache and infertility. They dealt with loss. And I think that so many of those emotions are common to today, where we feel overwhelmed, or like maybe God isn't aware of our situation, or he's not listening. He doesn't see our losses. There have been many occasions for people like that, whether you're a person of faith or if maybe you felt drawn to that over the last year because you've kind of felt at the end of your rope. I think people have been searching spiritually in a lot of ways and looking for something much more comforting than, the gloom and doom that the world has had to offer us the last year. And people are still very much dealing with financial ruin or having lost a loved one. And I'm hoping that through these pages, they'll be encouraged to see how, in their deepest sorrow, God was there with these women, and he lifted them up and he walked them through really dark valleys. And I think we all have moments like that. And certainly this last year has really exacerbated that for a lot of folks.
You quote a lot of scripture through the book as you go through these stories. Do you think that sometimes the Bible intimidates people, where the language of the Bible, they can't quite necessarily understand everything that's there, and that books like yours help people understand better?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I certainly hope so. I think for a lot of people, if you read the traditional English translation that we have, the King James Version that it's known as, there are these and thous, and people, the sentence structure isn't like modern English.
Right.
And so I do think people get a little overwhelmed, like, oh, sounds like, the language of the kings and of the royalty from the, 1600s and 1700s. And, but the great thing is there are so many Bible translations now that are in what we would consider modern American English that make it much easier to understand. And so a lot of times, in writing the book, I would go to different translations to see how it had been interpreted. I don't speak the original Greek or Aramaic or Hebrew, so those are very helpful to me to go back and say, like, hey, this one sounds like a conversation I would have now. There's one translation a lot of folks use these days called The Message, and it's written much more in a conversational tone, but trying to stay true to the text and accurate to the Bible at the time it was translated and written. So I hope that this book, in telling these stories, because some of them have so many twists and turns. They would be bestseller books if they were written as these individual stories, or blockbuster movies. And hopefully people would say, gosh, I didn't know the Bible was that interesting, or that women were such prominent characters. And hopefully in reading the book, they'll see that, and it will feel more approachable and more relatable to them.
And at the end of each section of the pairs of women, you put study questions. Is that to maybe inspire people to have Bible study type groups?
Yeah, I love study questions myself, whether you do them yourself. Right now I'm reading through a book during Lent that has the questions every day, which then kind of helps me to internalize what I've read or apply it to myself or figure out what it means for me. And I hope that people will do these individually or as a group. I always get more by hearing from other people in a group who studied or read and have different perspectives. I always find that to be really helpful and to point out things I didn't see. So I think whether you do it alone or as a group, I hope the questions will give you a deeper understanding or maybe application of what you've read. But I always enjoy finding those in books, and so I'm glad we included them here too.
The new book is The Women of the Bible Speak, the wisdom of 16 women and their lessons for today. Brand new from Shannon Bream, the host of Fox News at Night. Shannon, good luck with it, and it was great to talk to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, you too.
Fox News Radio on demand on the Fox News app. Download the app and just click listen. When you swipe left, you can listen to your favorite Fox News talk shows live. Swipe right for the latest Fox News Radio newscasts on demand. Fox News Radio on the Fox News app. Download it today. Subscribe to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Mike Huckabee.
What's on your mind?
As we learned from the recent hit documentary about Britney Spears' ongoing conservatorship battle to regain control of her life, abuse of this legal mechanism is a national epidemic in need of drastic reform. The New York Times feature, which was released in early February, exposed some shocking details about Spears' legal dispute with her father, who has done everything in his power to keep control over the singer's personal finances since she turned 26 years old. Am I the most unlikely person you'd ever expect to be siding with Britney Spears over her father? Well, no, not at all. I recognize the artistic gifts Britney has, but she should also enjoy the personal freedom that every American adult should experience. It's possible she might make business or even artistic mistakes with her life, but like the rest of us, she's entitled to make decisions for her own life. So unless she's about to commit imminent physical harm to others or herself, Britney Spears ought to be free to make her own decisions about her life and career. In 2019, Spears' case gained national attention thanks to the Free Britney movement on social media, which highlighted the behavior of the singer's father and other players in her inner circle. The ongoing media interest in Britney Spears' legal struggle, however, comes with its own curse. It creates a perception that the pop icon is a unique victim of a dysfunctional family corrupted by sudden fame and wealth. Sadly, this is not so. The enormous scope of the conservatorship abuse epidemic goes way beyond Britney Spears, but it often gets ignored by mainstream news outlets that mainly cover famed celebrities and prominent public figures. In recent years, dozens of guardianship abuse cases have sparked outrage in communities across America. One of the most extreme examples of this abuse occurred in Alabama, where one of the state's most generous philanthropists, the late Golden Flake heiress Joanne Baczynski, spent the last days of her life fighting to protect her own estate in what Joel Blankenship, the legal counsel for the Joanne Baczynski estate, called, quote, as predatory and exploitative a case as I've ever seen, end quote. Court documents detail how that for the better part of a year, she repeatedly requested that her employees, John McElroy and Patty Townsend, diversify her investments, and they continually ignored her request. Finally, after finding out that they also unilaterally wrote themselves into her will, Baczynski was left with no other choice but to terminate their employment. In apparent retaliation, McElroy and Townsend filed an emergency petition alleging that Baczynski had dementia and was unfit to handle her own estate. Baczynski's personal physician, based on his own evaluation and consultations with both a geriatrician and neurologist, found her perfectly competent, stating clearly that she did not have dementia or any other psychiatric or neurological conditions. Now, that didn't stop Jefferson County Probate Judge Alan King from granting the temporary order and appointing Greg Hawley as conservator of Mama B's $200 million plus estate in October of 2019. After more than a year of legal battles, the Alabama Supreme Court finally overturned the emergency conservatorship back in 2020. Despite the wild media frenzy around Britney Spears, conservatorship abuse is a nationwide epidemic that impacts countless U.S. seniors with very little legal recourse available for the conservatives to escape it. And that's precisely why it deserves national bipartisan reform and a grassroots campaign to protect the most vulnerable members of our society who are entrapped by it. This is Mike Huckabee.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. New from the Fox News Podcasts Network.
My name is Kennedy, and welcome to my podcast, which will, I humbly say, single-handedly save the world. You're welcome.
It's Kennedy Saves the World. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.